Elijah Carr walked into Harvard with a dream. By the end of the semester, he was accused of stealing his own invention. A white professor called his genius unrealistic. His AI-powered energy grid could light up cities. So why did the university give him a failing grade? They erased his project, tried to erase him. But what Elijah did next, no Ivy League institution was ready for. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. 12-year-old Elijah Carr had already figured out how to rewire a busted fan by the time most kids in his class were still fumbling through long division. In East Baltimore's Oliver neighborhood, genius didn't look like him. It didn't live in homes with roaches crawling between food stamps, or in boys who came to school in hand-me-down shoes, too tight at the toes. In this part of the city, broken things stayed broken. Homes, systems, trust. But Elijah wasn't wired to leave things broken. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment with his mother, Tasha Carr, whose silence after work said more about exhaustion than words ever could. She cleaned houses in the mornings and worked nights at a nursing home. Her hands were always cracked, her back always sore, but she made space for Elijah. She never told him to stop opening up radios or gutting old speakers, even when their tiny living room turned into a graveyard of circuit boards and wires. "You learning something, baby?" she'd ask, and he'd nod with a shy pride in his eyes. That was enough for her. His father, Darnell Carr, had been in prison since Elijah was 6. A robbery conviction tied to mistaken identity had swallowed up his freedom. Every month, Elijah and his mother took 2 buses and a train to visit him. Darnell would press his palms to the thick visiting glass, voice steady. "Use your mind, Eli. That's the one thing they can't lock up. They fear that more than fist." Elijah never forgot that. Not when kids teased him for being too quiet. Not when teachers accused him of copying answers he never needed to copy. At school, Elijah blended into the background, seen but never really looked at. His teachers saw his blackness before his brilliance. They praised white students who asked half the questions he did. When he answered too fast, they told him to stop showing off. When he questioned the textbook, they sent him to the principal's office. One time, when he stayed after school to finish building a homemade flashlight using copper wires from a toy car, the janitor accused him of trying to steal lab supplies. He got 2 days of in-school suspension. The flashlight ended up in the trash. Despite everything, Elijah kept building. He spent weekends at the public library. Not to escape his neighborhood, but to understand it, its failing power grids, its crumbling infrastructures, the price of light. He read books about Nikola Tesla, watched free MIT lectures online, and downloaded pirated PDFs on clean energy. He learned the language of code, like it was a second skin. By 14, he could break down an old desktop computer, replace the hard drive, and breathe life into it again, like a surgeon with defibrillator paddles. He applied to every STEM camp he could find. Robotics programs, maker fairs, science academies. Each application came back with some version of the same line. "We regret to inform you." Some didn't even bother responding. His classmates called him weird. His teachers, when forced to acknowledge his talents, dismissed them as lucky guesses. One guidance counselor told him that trade school might be a better fit. Elijah didn't argue. He didn't ask for more. He just kept building. When the science fair rolled around in 9th grade, Elijah scavenged for parts in dumpsters, pawn shops, and Craigslist listings. He built a miniature energy circuit that stored solar power and redistributed it based on neighborhood usage needs. A kind of microgrid solution he hoped could keep lights on during power outages, like the ones that often hit his block. He stayed up 3 nights in a row testing it. He missed breakfast and dozed off in math class. The day of the fair, he walked in, carrying a fragile, clunky prototype wrapped in an old towel. He stood next to a white girl, whose parents had helped her design a volcano that erupted glitter, and a boy who built a Lego robot using a $600 kit. Elijah's table had no decorations, just copper coils, cracked solar panels, and possibility. The judges barely looked at his work. One of them, a retired teacher, asked, "Where'd you learn to do this?" The tone wasn't curiosity. It was suspicion. The volcano won first prize. Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't protest. He just went home, took apart the prototype, improved the circuit, and tested it again. The school never recognized him, but someone was watching. 3 weeks after the science fair, an envelope arrived in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a voucher to attend a state robotics competition in DC. with travel and lodging fully paid. No explanation, no strings, just a handwritten note. Build something the world can't ignore. He hadn't even applied. Elijah went alone. He had never stayed in a hotel before. He wore his only collared shirt and prayed no one would ask him what school he came from. When he arrived at the convention center, he saw machines that walked, drones that danced, AI programs that predicted stock prices. Still, he set up his scrappy energy circuit, now more compact, with newly designed storage cells. Most students passed by without looking. Some scoffed. One boy whispered, "Looks like junk." But Elijah focused on his wires, tweaking voltage, smoothing data flow. He didn't even notice the two men in tailored suits watching from a distance, one of whom would later teach at Harvard. Elijah didn't win the competition, but he won something else. Attention. A week later, he was offered a seat in a summer engineering program for underrepresented youth. Another letter arrived, unsigned, with just 2 words, "Keep going." He did. By the end of summer, he had designed a new type of capacitor. Nothing revolutionary, just something better. Simpler, more affordable, something that could help homes like his. He didn't know how far it would go. He didn't know that the fan he fixed at 12, the flashlight he never got to finish, and the energy circuit he refused to give up on, would all lead to the invention that would shake Harvard's science faculty at its core. He didn't know yet that being unseen was sometimes the perfect camouflage for building something unforgettable. What Elijah did with leftover scrap parts in a school basement would soon shock the entire Harvard science faculty. Elijah stepped into St. James High with the same quiet determination that had carried him through years of being overlooked. The school hallways smelled of polished floors and expensive textbooks, a sharp contrast to the worn-out corridors he had grown used to. He arrived on full scholarship, but even on the first day he could feel that the scholarship came with invisible strings. Students looked at him the way they looked at substitute teachers or cafeteria staff, present, but never belonging. His presence seemed to disrupt an unspoken order. Teachers noticed him immediately, though not the way he hoped. They watched him with a cautious interest, as if waiting for him to confirm a stereotype they had already assigned. Their eyes lingered on him longer, when something went missing, or when the classroom grew loud. Praise seldom found him, even when his work outpaced every rubric placed in front of him. Every time a grade came back lower than expected, he could sense the subtle justification behind it, a belief that someone like him must have copied or guessed. Classmates whispered behind his back with a strange mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Some said he didn't act black, as if they owned the definition, and he had somehow violated it. Others found his silence unsettling. His intelligence, instead of being admired, was treated as a performance piece no one asked for. Elijah didn't respond. He simply took mental notes, the same way he studied voltage behaviors in unstable circuits. His science teacher, Mr. Burrows, rarely allowed him the space to explore ideas aloud. Whenever Elijah raised his hand to ask a question that reached beyond the textbook, Burrows shifted uneasily, tapping his pen, dismissing the inquiry as unnecessary. He redirected the conversation to safer, simpler ground. Elijah quickly realized that curiosity was a privilege at St. James, not a common language. Still, his mind never rested. Even in the moments where voices around him turned sharp and judgmental, his imagination kept assembling possibilities in controlled chaos. As the months passed, Elijah began crafting something quietly extraordinary. His earlier prototype, the clunky energy circuit he had built from scraps, evolved into a compact, meticulously calibrated converter. It harvested small amounts of solar energy, stored it efficiently, and redistributed it without significant loss. He worked on it in long evenings, often in the dim corner of the school basement near the storage shelves. No one visited that space except him and the occasional janitor pushing a cart. If people dismissed him in classrooms, he found sanctuary in the hum of old machinery and the rhythm of wires pressed between his fingers. His converter was not polished. It carried the mismatched texture of components salvaged from abandoned electronics, but the internal structure was brilliant. The device recorded data, learned from usage habits, and recalibrated its output. It was more than a school project. It was a living demonstration of what a mind like his could do when unfiltered by doubt. He entered it into the school's annual science fair with careful optimism, not hope. Hope had a habit of bleeding out early, but a quiet certainty that the design itself could speak, even if no one wanted to listen to him. The science fair arrived with decorated trifold boards and rehearsed smiles. His table sat near the back, the space usually reserved for entries. Teachers didn't fully understand. The converter pulsed with a faint glow, highlighting its alternating current pathways in soft intervals. Students passed by, intrigued but unsure. Teachers paused long enough to nod, pretending comprehension. Burroughs studied it briefly, his expression carefully measured, the way people look at something they want to praise, but are afraid to acknowledge. A white student with a glitter-coated volcano model drew constant attention. Crowds gathered as the volcano erupted artificial lava in bright streams that stained the tablecloth. Cameras flashed. Judges smiled. The announcement of winners carried no suspense. The volcano received first place, celebrated as a creative achievement that captured scientific imagination. Elijah watched from his corner, neither surprised nor offended. His expression remained steady, the same quiet acceptance he had learned long ago. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. His energy instead shifted inward, toward improvement, toward evolution. By 16, he upgraded the converter so efficiently that it could power 3 small homes for 8 consecutive hours. He tested it secretly during community outages back home, watching porch lights flicker alive in silent triumph while the rest of the neighborhood waited for utility updates. His mother warned him to be careful, worried that someone might misunderstand or take advantage, but she never discouraged him from building. She had seen too many dreams deterred by fear. When St. James announced a regional STEM showcase, Elijah's science club mentor encouraged him to participate. The showcase promised not only recognition, but exposure. Universities sent representatives to scout potential talent. Elijah attended with his converter, sealed in a protective casing he had built from leftover acrylic sheets. He set up early, arranging his wiring with meticulous precision. He observed the other students' polished displays, many supported by corporate sponsorships or private mentors. His corner looked small, but it pulsed with potential. Throughout the day, students hovered around popular tables, while Elijah's remained overlooked. He had grown used to the pattern, the same social invisibility stitched into every environment he entered. Yet what stunned him wasn't the neglect from peers, but the indifference from visiting university representatives. None stopped at his exhibit. None asked questions. The Harvard representative, a well-dressed woman with an air of polished authority, walked directly past him, pausing to enthusiastically congratulate another student, whose project consisted of basic circuitry arrangements he had mastered years earlier. Elijah watched her move through the room with practiced certainty. She never once glanced toward his table. For a brief moment, disappointment pressed against his chest, but he swallowed it like he had swallowed countless other disappointments. He reminded himself that recognition didn't dictate capability. He finished the showcase with a quiet nod to his work, gathered his materials, and walked home through the crisp evening wind. But unnoticed didn't mean unseen. The next day, Elijah was summoned to the guidance office. He sat across from a counselor who rarely remembered his name, but now wore an expression clouded with surprise. She explained that one of the judges had quietly submitted a personal recommendation for him, noting that his submission demonstrated an advanced conceptual understanding beyond expected grade level. The judge remained anonymous. The counselor seemed almost confused, unsure how to reconcile the written praise with her existing image of him. And then came the twist he never expected. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at his home. The envelope bore a crest he recognized immediately, the same crest printed on the brochures that had once ignored him. Inside was an invitation. Harvard's Summer Innovation Program, a selective initiative designed to identify and support emerging scientific talent. The letter said he had been chosen based on a combination of merit, creativity, and potential. It cited a confidential recommendation. He reread the letter 3 times, feeling something complicated rise inside him. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't pride. It was the uneasy awareness that the same institution that now praised him would one day decide whether he belonged. He sensed possibility, but also danger. A doorway that could open into opportunity, or close around him like a trap. As he folded the letter and placed it carefully back into the envelope, something in his chest tightened. His instincts whispered a warning he couldn't yet articulate. The path ahead looked promising, but it carried shadows that felt too familiar. He sensed that stepping into Harvard's world could either amplify his brilliance or weaponize his isolation. He didn't know it then, but he was walking straight toward the institution that would try to erase the very genius it claimed to celebrate. One overlooked recommendation later, Elijah received an invitation from the very place that would try to break him. Elijah arrived at Harvard with the cautious hope of someone who had spent a lifetime expecting doors to close. The campus felt impossibly large, its old brick buildings holding centuries of stories that had never included people who looked like him. He stepped through the imposing gates carrying his acceptance packet, a worn notebook, and the belief that maybe, just maybe, he had finally crossed into the meritocracy he'd been told America rewarded. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine belonging. But the silence started early. During orientation, students chatted in tight clusters formed long before he arrived. Their conversations flowed easily, full of private school familiarity, and shared histories from prep academies he had only seen in documentaries. When he introduced himself, some smiled politely but drifted away quickly. Others nodded with a practiced civility that felt more like a dismissal than acknowledgement. Elijah recognized that kind of silence. It was the same quiet distance he had felt in his old classrooms, the same invisible wall that separated expectation from acceptance. He took his seat on the first day of Advanced Systems Innovation, a course reserved for the top engineering minds on campus. He scanned the room, and quickly realized he was the only black student. He wasn't surprised, but the isolation still pressed against his chest with a familiar heaviness. The professor entered the room, Stephen Aldridge, a man with sharp eyes and the confident gait of someone accustomed to admiration. He introduced himself with a voice that carried an effortless authority, and when he reached Elijah during roll call, he paused just long enough for the moment to sting. Instead of saying his name correctly, Aldridge stretched it out loosely, mispronouncing it in a way that felt intentional. When Elijah quietly corrected him, Aldridge nodded dismissively, repeating the incorrect version anyway, as though the correction had never happened. To the rest of the class, it seemed minor. To Elijah, it was a signal, not a mistake, a message. Over the next weeks, the silence grew colder. When group projects were assigned, Elijah found himself sitting alone after the dust of seat shuffling settled. Groups formed quickly, leaving him without an invitation. He approached several tables, only to be told the groups were already full. Some students avoided eye contact altogether, pretending to be too engrossed in their laptops to notice him. He eventually completed the assignments alone, finishing work meant for 4 people, with the accuracy and discipline he had developed from years of working in isolation. Even then, the professor's feedback was terse and uninterested. He wrote comments that ignored innovation and highlighted minor formatting issues as justification for lower grades. Some days classmates addressed him as Mr. Baltimore, not with curiosity but with a hint of amusement, as if the nickname reduced him to a stereotype or a punchline. Elijah knew the tones people used when they wanted to remind someone where they came from. He felt the weight of it each time the words floated across the room. He pretended not to notice. He kept his head down and worked. The real turning point came when Elijah submitted his first major proposal for the class. He had designed an AI-powered energy grid capable of learning consumption patterns, reducing waste, and redistributing unused power in real time. It was the kind of design that could shift the way underserved communities experienced electricity. He had worked on it for weeks, refining the algorithms, adding safety layers, adjusting the model to handle grid fluctuations. When he turned it in, he expected critique, but he also expected recognition for the complexity and potential impact of the design. Aldridge returned the paper with a single sentence written at the top. Not realistic. There were no comments about the algorithm, no analysis of the model, no acknowledgement of its creativity, just dismissal. Elijah read the words again and again, hearing the unspoken message beneath them. Not realistic for someone like him. Not realistic, because the idea came from a student whose presence in the room still felt to many like an anomaly. Elijah kept the paper folded in his backpack, a reminder that even Harvard carried ecosystems where brilliance was filtered through bias. As the semester unfolded, Elijah noticed classmates copying fragments of his ideas. In group discussions, they echoed concepts he had introduced quietly during early sessions, presenting them with confidence as if they were original thoughts. When the professor praised those contributions, Elijah sat still, letting the sting settle without reaction. He remembered his father's words from years earlier, spoken through a thick sheet of visitation glass. Survive first, then speak. So he survived the silence. He survived the erasure. He survived the weight of being the only one. Every night, Elijah walked back to his dorm through the cold Harvard air, carrying notebooks filled with equations, sketches, and half-finished concepts. He worked in silence, building models the way some people prayed, steadily, faithfully, without expecting the world to listen. He didn't tell his mother the details. He didn't tell anyone how lonely brilliance felt when no one wanted to see it. Yet beneath the quiet cruelty of the environment, Something else was happening. Elijah's work was evolving. Pressure sharpened him. Isolation forced focus. He didn't create to win praise anymore. He created because invention was the only place he felt whole. His notebooks filled with ideas that stretched far beyond classroom assignments. Ideas shaped by his childhood, by outages in Baltimore, by the memory of neighbors living in darkness, because someone decided their zip code didn't matter. A twist arrived at the midpoint of the semester. Subtle but powerful. One evening, Elijah overheard two students in the engineering lounge discussing an upcoming departmental showcase. They mentioned innovation categories, judging criteria, and potential awards. His name never surfaced, not even as speculation. But when he leaned closer, pretending to sort through his papers, he noticed something strange. One of the students held notes written in handwriting that looked eerily familiar, his own. He recognized the diagrams, the layout, the phrasing. They had taken photos of his work during a study session he had attended briefly, copying ideas he had scribbled in the margin. The betrayal tightened something inside him, not in anger but in clarity. It confirmed what the silence had already hinted. They didn't doubt his abilities. They feared them. They weren't ignoring him because he lacked talent. They were ignoring him because acknowledging him meant admitting that brilliance could come from someone they didn't expect. Elijah didn't confront them. He simply walked out of the lounge, with a deeper understanding of the terrain he was navigating. The true blow came later, delivered not by peers, but by Aldridge himself. One afternoon, after class, the professor asked him to stay behind. The room emptied slowly, leaving only the hum of the overhead lights and the towering presence of the man who had spent months reducing him to an afterthought. Aldridge leaned against the desk, arms crossed, wearing an expression Elijah couldn't immediately read. He told Elijah he had been assigned a new project for the second half of the course. The tone was firm, almost deliberate, carrying the cadence of a test disguised as opportunity. Elijah listened carefully. The assignment was unlike anything given to other students. While they were tasked with improving existing energy models, Elijah's prompt demanded something unrealistically complex. A fully original system design, with no theoretical errors, built from scratch, solvable only with resources he didn't have access to. Aldridge presented it with a faint smile, a smile that carried challenge rather than encouragement. Elijah understood instantly. This wasn't an opportunity. It was a dare, a trap, an impossible task crafted to expose him, embarrass him, or push him out. He accepted it without reaction. He gathered his materials, nodded once, and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him, with a finality that echoed down the hall. Students outside didn't know what had been handed to him. They didn't see the weight of the assignment or the intent wrapped inside it. But Elijah knew, and as he walked back to his dorm, his mind already began assembling the pieces of a problem he wasn't meant to solve. He felt something new rising in him. Not fear, not resentment. Something sharper. Something that whispered that maybe Aldridge had underestimated the very student he wanted to break. Until Aldridge assigned him the impossible project and dared him to fail. Elijah stared at the prompt on his laptop screen long after the classroom had emptied. The fluorescent lights hummed above him, flickering faintly, as though even the building itself sensed the trap he had walked into. The assignment was short, only one sentence, but it carried the weight of something deliberately engineered to break him. Design a new, untested energy solution with zero theoretical errors, or fail. There was no rubric, no examples, no scope limit, nothing to anchor the expectations, except the near certainty that success was statistically impossible. Every other student in advanced systems innovation had received tasks with clear guidelines: simulate existing systems, refine known algorithms, optimize energy flows already tested in academic literature. Elijah alone was thrust into a blank universe and told to invent a new star from scratch. Aldridge's smile earlier replayed in his mind. Not encouraging, not challenging, provocative. Elijah recognized that smile. It was the same expression men used when they wanted to make a point without speaking it aloud. But Elijah didn't crumble. He had learned long ago that fear had no place in the spaces where he built things. He folded the printed assignment, slid it into his notebook, and walked calmly out of the room. On the inside, his thoughts shook like loose wires: frustration, hunger, rising determination, all knotting together. But the surface remained still. He refused to let Aldridge see even a fraction of what he felt. Back in his dorm, he paced the room in the dim glow of his desk lamp. The walls were thin, the carpet worn, and his roommate was rarely around, leaving him in solitude most nights. The air sat heavy with the kind of pressure that either suffocates or solidifies resolve. Elijah knew which outcome he would choose. He sat at his desk, opened a blank notebook, and wrote the date at the top. Beneath it, he scribbled the sentence that would shape the next several weeks of his life. They want me to fail, so I won't. He began by designing a problem bigger than the assignment itself. If Aldridge demanded the impossible, Elijah would build something so comprehensive, so structurally sound, that even sabotage couldn't erase its brilliance. He mapped out energy shortages in low-income neighborhoods across the country. He charted the cost of existing infrastructure repairs, the instability of outdated grids, the cyclical poverty tied to power outages. His pages filled quickly, each line of ink a quiet rebellion. The design that followed was born from the world he had lived in, the powerlessness he had seen firsthand, and the ingenuity that had always existed in the margins of his life. He imagined a network without dependency on traditional grids, a decentralized system that allowed homes, businesses, and small buildings to share and store energy effortlessly, a model that could function even in fragile neighborhoods often ignored by energy companies. His childhood, marked by darkness during outages and candlelit homework sessions, guided him. His past wasn't a weight, it was a blueprint. He worked alone for hours each night, pausing only when his vision blurred or when hunger forced him to acknowledge the untouched food on his desk. Some nights he skipped meals entirely, not because he wanted to, but because the momentum felt too precious to interrupt. He spent afternoons in the basement labs, swiping in with his student ID, even when the space was empty and the machines hummed with abandoned purpose. The underground labs smelled of metal dust and static electricity, and the overhead lights buzzed with a soft, uneven pitch. It was far from glamorous, but it reminded him of the Baltimore basement, where he had first discovered the language of circuitry. He coded for hours, lines of logic scrolling across the screen like a conversation only he understood. He taught his AI model to recognize energy surpluses and deficits, predicting usage patterns based on time of day, weather, neighborhood demographics, and household routines. He programmed it to store excess energy, distribute it intelligently, and adapt quickly to sudden changes in demand. The system learned from itself, evolving each time he fed it new data. Elijah could feel it growing, almost like a living organism, responsive, intuitive, and quietly brilliant. He soldered components on makeshift desks, fingers trembling with exhaustion but never losing precision. He built miniature versions of the network using cheap microcontrollers he had salvaged from old campus electronics. Each piece clicked into place with the satisfying certainty of purpose. He didn't tell anyone what he was building. It felt safer that way. Harvard had taught him early that privacy wasn't paranoia, it was protection. Weeks passed, and Elijah blended into the background of campus life. Students walked past him without knowing he carried with him nights of work that had early morning sunrises slipping quietly into his room. Professors lectured while his mind raced with calculations and structural models. The dining hall buzzed with conversations about internships, travel plans, and research grants, none of which included him. Elijah existed between worlds, visible enough to be graded, invisible enough to be overlooked. But progress came, slow but unstoppable. One night, while running simulations, the AI model stabilized fully for the first time. The decentralized system self-corrected, balancing every power fluctuation Elijah threw at it. The prototype's tiny lights flickered in synchronized patterns, forming a rhythm of energy exchange that felt almost elegant. Elijah exhaled with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a long-awaited sunrise. He pressed his palms against the edge of the desk, grounding himself, absorbing the moment. For a heartbeat, the world felt clear. But the twist arrived when he attempted to save the final data file. The system froze. Lines of code stuttered. The screen glitched. A corrupted message blinked in red across the display, warning that someone had accessed his cloud folder earlier in the day. His heart kicked hard. He checked the logs. The intrusion came from a Harvard faculty network. No specific name, no timestamp beyond a rough window of hours. But the implication was sharp and unmistakable. Someone had been watching him. Someone had tried to see what he was building. Someone wanted to know how close he was to succeeding. Elijah stared at the screen, the weight of the intrusion sinking into his chest like a cold stone. But instead of panic, something steadier spread across his thoughts, a determined, sharpened calm. If someone wanted to steal his work, or sabotage it, they would have to work harder than this. He rebuilt the file security protocols, encrypted the design, and saved multiple offline versions. His mind raced with the awareness that his project had become more than an assignment. It had become a threat. He didn't tell anyone. Not the TA who occasionally nodded at him. Not the lab assistant who sometimes loaned him spare parts. Not even the one friend he occasionally sat with in the dining hall. Silence was safer. Silence meant control. By the time the deadline arrived, Elijah had built something far beyond the scope of any class project. His system wasn't just functional, it was transformative. A decentralized energy-sharing network capable of powering low-income communities with near-zero cost. An AI-backed solution that adjusted itself without human oversight. A model built from lived experience and relentless innovation. He compiled the report, attached diagrams, coded the algorithms neatly, and submitted everything. For one brief moment, as he uploaded the files, he allowed himself to imagine Aldridge's reaction. The shock, the forced acknowledgement, the reluctant respect. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment everything shifted. But Harvard wasn't built to shift for boys like him. A week later, Aldridge returned the graded assignment with the same expression he wore when he mispronounced Elijah's name. Controlled, dismissive, intentional. Elijah slipped into an empty hallway, leaned against the wall, and opened the file. A D. No comments, no critique. Just a single accusation written at the top of the page like a deliberate wound. This appears plagiarized. The hallway blurred for a moment, not from tears but from the sudden brutal clarity of understanding. Aldridge hadn't assigned him the impossible to humble him. He had assigned it so he could claim the failure belonged to Elijah. Or worse, claim the success for himself. But when he submitted it, Aldridge gave him a D, and claimed the design was plagiarized. The morning after Elijah received the D, campus seemed quieter than usual, though he knew the silence came from inside him, not around him. The accusation clung to his skin like cold residue, each step through Harvard Yard feeling heavier than the last. Students hurried to classes, bundled in expensive coats, clutching leather bags, moving through their routines with the certainty of belonging. Elijah walked among them, carrying the weight of a judgment he hadn't earned. The sun pressed down on the brick paths, but nothing could warm the sinking dread forming at the center of his chest. The email came just after noon. He was summoned to an academic integrity hearing. A panel. Multiple faculty members. No details shared. Only a subject line that read urgent, inquiry into academic misconduct. The words didn't surprise him. He had seen them coming the moment he read Aldridge's comment. But the official tone of it, the university's clinical language, made the betrayal feel deeper. Harvard didn't ask him for clarification. It demanded a defense. He wasn't seen as a student anymore. He was now an investigation. In the days that followed, Elijah's life became a slow, suffocating spiral of scrutiny. He was questioned in fluorescent-lit rooms by professors who didn't look at him as a peer, but as a suspect. They asked how he had written certain algorithms, how he had calculated load balancing systems, how he had learned neural feedback loops. The questions were framed as curiosity, but the subtext was sharp. How did someone like you know this? That was the real inquiry. The unspoken accusation. Not that the code was wrong, but that it was too good to come from him. His dorm was searched. His hard drives were cloned. His cloud access was revoked. He had to surrender his personal laptop for data verification. They scanned his notes, questioned his timestamps, and cross-checked his browsing history. One professor even asked if he had assistance from someone more technically fluent. Elijah said nothing. His silence wasn't compliance. It was resistance. His father had taught him long ago that in systems built to trap you, your words were often used as rope. He continued to attend classes, though no one spoke to him now. Whispers trailed him through lecture halls. Peers avoided sitting near him. One student dropped out of their group project after claiming they were uncomfortable. Another reported him for intimidating presence, though no incident had occurred. Elijah said nothing. The isolation was complete. And still the inquiry dragged on. He sat through 3 hearings, each more sterile than the last. The panel members, dressed in polished suits and stiff smiles, repeated versions of the same question. Why didn't you collaborate more openly? Why didn't anyone else review your work before submission? Why was your model so advanced? They never asked about his sleepless nights, never asked about the basement lab or the hunger or the borrowed parts or the solder burns on his fingers. They didn't see the 13-year-old who taught himself calculus by reading stolen library books, or the boy who powered a neighbor's home during a blackout. All they saw was a design they couldn't trace to someone they respected, and a student they didn't expect to succeed. When the panel finally reached a decision, they found no direct evidence of plagiarism. No copied code, no stolen models, no signs of third-party involvement. But they also refused to clear him. The statement was carefully worded. While we cannot conclusively determine misconduct, concerns remain regarding the originality of the submitted work. In academic language, it was a scarlet letter. Elijah had technically passed, but only in the way a person escapes a fire with their clothes still smoldering. They recommended he retake the course under faculty supervision. Elijah declined. He returned to his dorm that night and stared at the ceiling for hours. His notebooks were still stacked neatly on the shelf. His prototype sat in a locked case beneath his desk, untouched since the submission. The code still lived on a flash drive hidden behind his mattress. The invention was his. Every line, every calculation, every innovation. And yet he had been treated like a thief. So he made a decision. Without announcing it to anyone, he walked to the city's small intellectual property office. It was cold that morning, and the wind sliced through the corners of his coat. The office was unimpressive. Dim lighting, old carpet, the smell of copy toner lingering in the air. He filled out the forms alone. He printed diagrams and design sheets. He filed a provisional patent without Harvard's name on it, without Aldrich's oversight, without a single institution claiming stake in his work. He paid the fee with money saved from tutoring and skipped meals. The clerk barely looked at him as she stamped the paperwork. No fanfare, no recognition. But Elijah didn't need applause. What he needed was ownership. That evening, as he left the building, he felt something shift inside him. Not relief, not pride, something quieter, stronger. The invention that Harvard tried to discredit now lived under his name, legally, permanently, undeniably. He didn't post about it, didn't tell anyone. He returned to his dorm, passed quietly through the dining hall, and resumed his routine. The whispers didn't stop. The isolation continued. But something in him had settled. A line had been drawn. He had built something in silence, and now it existed beyond the reach of those who doubted him. Days passed, then a week, then something strange happened. A small blog that tracked new patents in renewable tech published a brief article about his filing. Just a few lines. A name, a description, a concept summary. But the right eyes saw it. A solar tech executive shared the link on LinkedIn. A professor at MIT reposted it with a comment. Smart, efficient, community-centric. Who is this? Then a tweet followed. Short, loud, and viral. This 19-year-old just filed a smarter grid than most Silicon Valley startups. The post exploded. In less than 48 hours, Elijah's name spread across tech spaces. Scientists emailed him. Journalists requested interviews. Startups reached out with interest. His inbox flooded. Comments poured in. Messages from strangers, Black engineers, students, mothers, inventors, all thanking him, supporting him, recognizing him. The silence Harvard had wrapped him in was pierced by the sound of the world noticing. And Harvard noticed too. A formal email arrived from the dean's office, carefully worded and rehearsed. We've followed the emerging coverage of your recent filing and would be interested in discussing opportunities for institutional support moving forward. Please let us know if you're open to collaboration. Support. The same university that tried to suffocate his name now wanted to stamp theirs onto his creation. Elijah didn't reply. Not yet. What he didn't know was that the patent would soon go viral, and Harvard would come crawling back. It started as a ripple. 3 weeks after Elijah filed his patent, a mid-tier tech blogger based out of San Jose posted a brief write-up on the design. The blog wasn't flashy, just a modest site tracking under-the-radar filings in green tech. But the title caught attention. Harvard student quietly files next-gen energy sharing system. Is this the future of power? There were no flashy photos, just Elijah's name, the patent filing number, and a short technical summary that barely scratched the surface of the invention. But sometimes brilliance doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs the right set of eyes. The post was retweeted by a junior researcher at Tesla, then again by a prominent MIT professor known for publishing disruptive energy papers. A few software engineers on Reddit dug into the filing details. They were stunned. The model's logic was clean. its efficiency rates nearly unmatched. Within hours, threads formed analyzing the code patterns. Diagrams from the filing were reposted. Questions arose. Who is this kid? Why isn't he funded? Why is he not in every major lab in the country? By the end of the week, the ripple had become a wave. LinkedIn lit up with think pieces about microgrids, the decentralization of energy, and the future of community-based power models. Elijah's name was tagged in dozens of posts, many quoting phrases from the patent that only those familiar with real-world outages would have written. Venture capital firms began emailing him, some cautious, others pushy. One VC offered a symbolic $1 to license the concept. Then another offered $10, then $5,000. Within days, offers ballooned. One email marked confidential offered $3 million upfront, with an additional $5 million in back-end equity if Elijah would sell his rights and walk away. He didn't even open it fully. Elijah wasn't building to sell. He was building to be heard. For the first time, the world had no choice but to listen. The email requests for interviews began to pile up. Journalists from Wired, TechCrunch, Forbes, and even The Atlantic wanted to feature the story. Elijah declined most of them. He wasn't interested in being edited down to a soundbite. But one offer, from a grassroots YouTube tech channel, stood out. They didn't ask about equity or commercialization. They asked what the invention meant, what he had built it for, why now. Elijah agreed. The interview was quiet, unpolished, filmed in a community library where he once fixed broken Chromebooks for free. He sat in front of a plain wall, wearing a hoodie and jeans, his voice steady but sharp. He didn't use jargon. He didn't smile much. Instead, he told the story exactly as it happened. He spoke about the invention, the decentralized grid that could bypass outdated infrastructure, prioritize energy where it was needed most, and learn from usage patterns to adapt in real time. He explained how it could help neighborhoods like his, where power flickered not because of natural disasters, but because the city stopped caring long ago. Then he told the other part, the part no one had expected. He explained how Harvard gave him an assignment they didn't expect him to survive, how Aldrich called his work unrealistic, how his invention, once submitted, was labeled plagiarized without evidence. He told them about the inquiry, the suspicion, the silence, the hearings, the surveillance. He laid bare the racism, not as an accusation, but as a fact structured into the academic algorithms meant to dict genius, but only when it came in expected packaging. The video was uploaded late that night. By morning, it had 1 million views. The title alone caught fire. From plagiarist to pioneer, the black Harvard student they tried to silence. Twitter caught on first, then TikTok. Then the news cycle followed. Elijah's face flooded timelines. Clips from the video were stitched with reaction videos from creators around the world. Young engineers posted tearful responses. Black students from Ivy League schools shared their own stories. Grades lowered without explanation. Projects doubted. Office doors closed too early. Hashtags began to trend. On Harvard owes Elijah. From plagiarist to pioneer. Let Elijah build. The comments section filled with rage and reverence. It wasn't just about energy anymore. Elijah had become something larger, an avatar for every brilliant mind whose light had been dimmed by bias, bureaucracy, and bigotry. His quiet defiance had made him a symbol. The patent wasn't just technology. It was testimony. Harvard stayed silent for 5 days. Then, on the 6th, they issued a statement. It was published in a sterile PDF format on their website and distributed to select media outlets. The tone was familiar, deflective, polished, vague. We take pride in the diversity of our student body, and deeply regret any miscommunications that may have led to misunderstandings around Mr. Carr's academic experience. We support all our students equally, and remain committed to fostering innovation and inclusion. They called his story a misunderstanding. No apology. No acknowledgement of the accusation. No mention of the panel hearings, the surveillance, the forced silence. Just a soft-edged phrase meant to mute public outrage. But it didn't work. Instead, the statement ignited more fury. People dissected the wording. News anchors questioned it live on air. Student activists at Harvard organized campus protests, carrying signs that read, "Innovation without recognition is exploitation." Alumni wrote open letters demanding an external investigation. A former black student who had dropped out of the engineering program came forward with similar claims against Aldrich. And then came the twist. A former TA under Aldridge anonymously released screenshots of internal emails. One of them was dated just 2 weeks before Elijah received it. It read, "Keep an eye on Carr. His project is too ambitious for someone with his background." Another, "If we don't contain this early, he'll start thinking he belongs." The internet erupted. The misunderstanding now had receipts. Harvard scrambled to update their statement. They promised a thorough internal review. Aldridge declined all interview requests. The faculty lounge became a whisper zone. But the damage was done. Elijah watched it all unfold in silence. He didn't celebrate, didn't gloat. The vindication was bitter, not sweet. Because while the world finally believed him, it had taken pain and humiliation to get there. The same invention they had called too advanced was now called visionary. Only after it was out of Harvard's reach. And still, Elijah refused to license it. The offers kept rising. $5 million. Then $9. A partnership with a Silicon Valley firm offered $11.2 million. Full ownership and a guaranteed seat on their board. He turned them all down. Not because he didn't value the money, but because he knew that selling his invention would mean surrendering its purpose. He hadn't built it to enrich venture capitalists. He built it so the lights would stay on in places like East Baltimore. He wanted ownership, not just of the design, but of the future it could create. That's when a representative from Harvard's administration requested a private meeting. Not via email. In person. They said they wanted to make things right. They said the university recognized his potential. They said the institution hoped to support his continued innovation. Elijah agreed to the meeting. But not because he trusted them. Because he needed to look them in the eyes when he told them no. That's when Harvard issued a statement, calling his story a misunderstanding. The morning Elijah's interview aired on national television. His name surged into headlines with a force no algorithm could contain. CNN, NPR, and MSNBC all reached out within hours of each other. What had started as a quiet uprising online was now breaking into living rooms, boardrooms, and academic halls across the country. The boy they tried to frame as a plagiarist was now being introduced as the black inventor who outthought Harvard. CNN led with the tagline, "Brilliance Ignored, the Elijah Carr Story." NPR aired a segment titled, "Too Smart to Be Believed." Elijah's voice, calm and precise, played over radio stations in taxis, classrooms, and early morning kitchens. Listeners weren't just hearing about a patent. They were hearing about the cost of genius, when filtered through suspicion. In engineering circles, his name echoed like myth. Black scientists called him a revelation. Students of color found his story familiar enough to sting, but rare enough to inspire. Prominent tech leaders spoke his name with awe. Some compared his energy-sharing system to innovations on par with early-stage internet protocols. Others marveled not just at the design but at the clarity of purpose behind it. His invention wasn't theoretical. It was rooted in the real-world power shortages he grew up surviving. But Harvard had a different response. Instead of issuing another statement, or clarifying their role in his project, the university quietly deleted his grades from the student portal. No email, no warning, just silence. His coursework vanished from view, his assignment records locked behind administrator permissions. When asked, the registrar's office replied with a single line, "Project was never finalized through proper academic channels." It was an institutional erasure. They weren't just denying credit. They were trying to disappear him. Aldridge, the professor at the center of the scandal, went dark. He declined interviews, avoided classes. Rumors circulated that he was on leave, but no one could confirm. His office remained locked, blinds drawn. Inside the faculty lounge, whispers simmered. He should have backed off. He went too far. This one got away. But Elijah didn't retaliate with fury. He retaliated with proof. He published a 27-page PDF on his personal site, a digital autopsy of everything Harvard tried to deny. Screenshots of submission timestamps, email threads with TAs discussing the code, original drafts saved on platforms that recorded version history, even snippets of the AI's test simulations, watermarked with creation dates that predated any claims of collaboration. The world read every page. Journalists fact-checked and found nothing false. Students shared the PDF like a manual on how to survive sabotage. A TikTok user turned it into a narrated slideshow. How Harvard tried to fail a future. It reached 4.7 million views in 2 days. And then came the protest. It began with 20 students, most of them black or brown, standing in Harvard Yard, with cardboard signs. One read, "He wasn't cheating. You were." Another, "You tried to fail a future." Photos hit Twitter. Local news picked it up. By the end of the week, over 300 students joined. Some skipped class. Some stood in silent formation outside Aldridge's office. Others marched to the administration building, chanting for transparency and justice. Media trucks parked at the edge of campus. Helicopter shots aired live footage of the crowd. Reporters approached anyone who would speak. But Elijah didn't attend. He stayed inside his dorm, answering emails, watching it unfold through his window like a storm he had triggered without raising his voice. And that's when the unexpected twist arrived. An email from a name he didn't recognize. Devon Gray. There was no subject line. Just a sentence in the body. "You don't know me, but I've known your work for years. We need to talk." Elijah researched the name and immediately understood why it mattered. Devon Gray was the son of Patrick Gray, the billionaire tech mogul behind ArcLight Energy, one of the largest clean energy firms in the world. But Devon wasn't just a trust fund heir. He had attended Harvard, had studied engineering, and as Elijah would soon learn, had been one of Aldridge's students. They met at a neutral spot in Cambridge, a quiet tea house where no cameras followed. Devon arrived dressed casually, but his demeanor was serious. He introduced himself without pretense, explained that he had been quietly following Elijah's work ever since the regional high school robotics event, years ago, the one Elijah never knew was being scouted. Devon had been in the audience that day, anonymously funding promising students from underserved backgrounds through a private initiative. Elijah had been one of them. That anonymous scholarship. Devon. The first robotics grant. Devon again. And now, after watching Harvard try to erase the very mind he once helped elevate, he had returned with more than just sympathy. He had leverage. Devon revealed that he still had access to an internal alumni innovation fund, one of Harvard's most private high-value accounts. It wasn't public. It wasn't visible. But it existed to fund projects and inventions connected to the university's name. And because Elijah had been enrolled at the time of his creation, Harvard had already filed a soft claim to his patent. Elijah's stomach turned. That was the play. If they couldn't erase him, they'd try to co-own him. But Devon had something else. A proposal. He offered to personally fund a legal team to challenge Harvard's backdoor claim to Elijah's work. Not only that, he promised to build Elijah a lab, independent, fully funded, under Elijah's name. No university, no corporate strings, just space, time, and trust. Elijah didn't respond immediately. He listened, watched, and realized something chilling. Harvard wasn't scrambling because he embarrassed them. They were scrambling because they thought he might win. And people like Elijah weren't supposed to win. They were supposed to rise just high enough to be showcased, but never so high that they challenged the hierarchy itself. He walked out of that tea house with a new understanding of what his story had become. It wasn't about a patent anymore. It was about who got to define genius, who got to own the future, and who was allowed to speak without being silenced. Harvard had taken cover behind silence and statements. But the world had taken notice. And now someone from their own alumni base, someone with money, power, and credibility, had just stepped forward and made them an offer that would turn the tables completely. Then a secret alum donor stepped forward and made Harvard an offer that would turn the tables. When Devon Gray stepped out of the tea house beside Elijah, he seemed far less like the heir to one of America's largest clean energy fortunes, and far more like someone who had been waiting years for a moment to finally speak. He held himself with a calmness that came from privilege, but his eyes carried something else: fatigue, guilt, and a familiarity with injustice that Elijah didn't expect from someone born into the top floor of society. The air outside hummed with the distant sound of student protests, but Devon didn't look at the campus or the chaos brewing around it. He looked at Elijah as if the truth he carried needed a witness who understood what it cost him to finally say it aloud. Devon explained that he had been following Elijah's work long before the patent went public. The anonymous sponsorships, the robotics trips, the educational programs, none of those were coincidence. Devon had been watching Elijah's progress since high school, believing that certain minds needed protection from systems that had a talent for destroying brilliance before it could bloom. But what Elijah didn't know was that Devon hadn't chosen him out of charity. He had chosen him out of recognition. Years earlier, Devon had sat in the same Harvard classroom, under the same professor, Stephen Aldridge. Back then, Devon was known as the quiet billionaire's son, who didn't need good grades to secure a future. He had walked onto campus with the kind of last name that softened every edge in academia. But privilege couldn't entirely shield him from Aldridge's behavior. Devon remembered the way Aldridge graded students differently based on who they were, how he subtly changed the tone of critiques depending on who answered, and how he celebrated mediocrity from students who reminded him of himself while punishing excellence from those who didn't fit his expectations. But Devon's experience was never equal to Elijah's, because Devon was white. His presence in that classroom might have irritated Aldridge, but it never threatened him. His intelligence was assumed, not questioned. His projects were treated as ambitious, not suspicious, and when he pushed back on unfair critiques, they were treated as assertiveness, not aggression. Devon had seen how much harsher Aldridge was with black and brown students, how often he dismissed them mid-sentence, how frequently he interrupted their ideas or told them their proposals were unrealistic. Devon had once considered reporting him, but the system didn't punish racism unless it became a scandal. Back then, Devon didn't have the courage, but watching what Harvard did to Elijah, watching them try to erase him, accuse him, cage him in suspicion, unleashed a guilt that had been quietly fermenting inside him for years. And that guilt came with receipts. Devon pulled out a small encrypted hard drive. He didn't say anything, but the heaviness in his movements told Elijah everything. On that drive were recordings, years' worth of material. Devon had gathered while in Aldridge's class, back when he first realized something was wrong but lacked the conviction to confront it. The files were time-stamped, backed up, and legally admissible. They were the kind of things that destroyed careers, not because they were shocking, but because they revealed truths institutions worked endlessly to bury. When Devon finally released the recordings publicly, the internet reacted as if a match had been thrown into gasoline. Video clips spread across social media like wildfire. In one audio file, Aldridge mocked the university's diversity initiatives, calling certain students performative add-ons. In another, he ranked students by race, in a private meeting, instructing TAs to watch the ones who come from unpredictable backgrounds. In the harsh clarity of those recordings, no one could claim misinterpretation. It wasn't subtle bias. It was structured prejudice spoken with the casual confidence of someone who believed he'd never be exposed. News outlets looped the audio on repeat. Students who had once doubted Elijah came forward with apologies. Alumni shared stories of their own experiences, times they felt diminished, dismissed, or undermined by Aldridge's presence in the department. Black faculty members, few as they were, released statements describing the hostile undercurrents they had learned to navigate quietly. The ripple of outrage spread through academic spaces with the speed of something long overdue. Harvard had no choice but to respond. Their new statement, more rehearsed than sincere, announced that Professor Stephen Aldridge had been placed on administrative leave, pending internal review. But the phrasing was thin, hollow. The public knew what placed on leave meant: temporary distance, until the storm passed, not accountability. The campus buzzed with the tension of students who recognized that institutions didn't change out of morality, they changed out of fear. But Elijah didn't watch Harvard's response with satisfaction. He watched it with exhaustion. He had never wanted to become a symbol or a scandal. He had wanted to build, to innovate, to create something meaningful from the broken pieces he inherited. But circumstances had turned him into something else, a mirror held up to a system that only saw genius when it arrived in familiar packaging. The protests outside Harvard's gates intensified. Students painted banners. Alumni sent letters demanding a full investigation. National networks ran split-screen segments comparing Elijah's patent with Aldridge's comments. The pressure was suffocating, not because Elijah feared it, but because he understood what it meant. His invention had become political long before it had become industrial. There was an unexpected twist amidst the chaos. Devon released one final recording, one he had hesitated to reveal. It wasn't about Aldridge's racism. It was about Elijah. It documented a private faculty discussion, where Aldridge claimed Elijah was dangerous because he was too driven, too sharp, and too unpredictable. He argued that students like Elijah needed academic containment to prevent them from overstepping. The language was clinical, but the intent was unmistakably violent, not physical, but intellectual violence, the kind designed to suffocate potential beneath bureaucracy. The world reacted with renewed anger. Commentators called the language chilling. Law professors questioned its legality. Engineers labeled it anti-innovation. And through it all, Elijah understood something he hadn't before. Aldridge hadn't been trying to fail his assignment. He had been trying to fail him as a person. With Harvard scrambling, Devon stepped forward again. This time, not with evidence, but with an offer. A laboratory. Fully funded. Fully independent. Under Elijah's name. A research center dedicated to energy accessibility, technological justice, and community-centered innovation. Devon explained that he had secured investors, not corporations, but individuals who believed in building progress outside institutional restraints. He wanted Elijah to run the lab, build breakthroughs without permission, hire overlooked minds, create a new ecosystem where talent wasn't filtered by bias. For the first time since arriving at Harvard, Elijah felt something unfamiliar and dangerous in its hope. Freedom. Not symbolic freedom. True freedom. The kind where his ideas belonged to him. The kind where no one could accuse him of stealing what he created. The kind where his work wasn't an exception. It was the start of a lineage. But the offer wasn't just generous. It was explosive. Because Devon wasn't finished. He wasn't building a lab just for Elijah. He was building a rival. A direct competitor to Harvard's engineering powerhouse. And he wanted Elijah to lead it. But Devon wasn't finished. He offered Elijah a lab of his own. Fully funded. Elijah didn't pause when Devon made the offer. He didn't need time to consider. He had spent his life calculating risks, navigating suspicion, surviving under scrutiny, yet nothing felt more certain than this moment. The lab wasn't just a chance to build, it was a chance to breathe. A space untouched by institutional doubt, unconstrained by rubrics, and free from the systems that once tried to collapse his name into a footnote. He said yes with a clarity sharpened by everything they'd tried to take from him. 6 weeks later, the doors opened. The lab stood on a reclaimed block of industrial space in South Boston, once a textile warehouse, now transformed into a sleek innovation hub, wrapped in glass and steel. Its exterior bore no ego, no corporate banners or plaques, just a small brushed metal sign mounted near the entrance. Carr Systems. The name alone was enough. Not a borrowed name, not a sponsor's. Inside, the space pulsed with energy. The air buzzed with electricity, literal and emotional. Wires ran across workstations. Modular screens floated between groups. The walls bore schematics, sketches, and notes in every color. But this wasn't a standard lab, and Elijah made sure it never felt like one. There were no gates to entry, no exclusive dress codes, no degrees required. His first hires weren't recruited from Ivy League databases. They came from overlooked corners of the country, places like Newark, Birmingham, Oakland, people who'd built brilliance in silence for too long. His team reflected the very communities his invention was meant to serve. There were Black engineers who had been passed over for grants, former high school dropouts who had taught themselves coding between night shifts, women who left toxic companies that claimed diversity but never practiced it, autistic developers, formerly incarcerated inventors. They arrived hesitant, unsure if the space was real, if someone like them was truly being invited to lead. Elijah welcomed them all. He didn't ask for GPAs. He asked for ideas. By the third month, Carr Systems had developed 3 working models of the decentralized grid. Each was tested using real consumption data gathered from urban neighborhoods that had suffered decades of power instability. The technology wasn't locked in theory. It was moving. It was alive. In East Detroit, the system restored electricity to a 12-unit housing block during a citywide outage. In South Central LA, it lit a community shelter for 4 consecutive days using surplus rooftop energy from surrounding buildings. Elijah didn't take the credit alone. Every press release carried his team's names. The lab became more than a facility. It became a movement. The media dubbed it the Revenge Lab. Headlines ran with cinematic flair. Harvard's mistake becomes a powerhouse. From sabotaged to CEO, Carr's Code of Justice. News cameras arrived to document the workspace, panning across desks covered in pizza boxes, motherboards, and laughter. Journalists expected resentment, but Elijah rarely talked about Harvard anymore. When asked, he always answered the same way. This isn't revenge, this is redistribution. His goal wasn't to punish, it was to rewire. He partnered with grassroots organizers instead of energy companies, shared blueprints with high schools in underfunded districts, launched free training programs that taught students how to install and manage microgrids in their own neighborhoods. In Baltimore, he personally delivered hardware kits to his old library. On the box was a simple label: "You don't have to ask permission to build." But not everyone celebrated. Behind the public praise and private funding, something darker stirred. Power doesn't like to be displaced. And Harvard had not forgotten. When the university's legal team first reached out, it was quiet. A letter from the Office of General Counsel, written in legalese meant to sound polite but threatening. They claimed that Elijah's invention had been developed using university resources, and therefore under IP policy, was partially the property of Harvard. They cited lab access logs, assignment prompts, and course policies, twisting context into leverage. Elijah read the letter without flinching. He saw it for what it was, an attempt to claw back control. Not over the tech, over the narrative. Because his lab was now the future, and Harvard had no part in it. They hadn't nurtured it. They had tried to smother it. Now they wanted their name attached to the fire they tried to extinguish. He responded with documents of his own, signed timestamps, independent development logs, funding receipts, and patent records filed without university aid. His team published a public dossier, outlining every step of the invention's evolution outside of institutional walls. But Harvard escalated. They filed an official lawsuit. The claim, misappropriation of university assets and breach of academic contract. It was national news within hours. Reporters flooded Carr systems, seeking comment. Elijah didn't hide. He stood in front of the lab's glass doors, surrounded by his team, and read a prepared statement. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't indict. He simply spoke the truth. He built it. They buried it. He kept building. Now they wanted credit. The lawsuit sparked a firestorm. Harvard faced massive backlash. Protesters returned to the campus gates. Hashtags resurfaced. Elijah trended again. Not as a tech prodigy, but as a symbol of systemic theft. Activists posted side-by-side timelines of his invention's growth and Harvard's obstruction. Academics from other universities called the suit intellectual colonialism. The phrase stuck. Commentators ran headlines. Harvard sues the genius they tried to silence. And then came the twist. While Harvard was busy filing legal motions, Carr Systems received an anonymous delivery, an unmarked envelope with internal emails. It was from inside Harvard. No name, no contact, just digital printouts of faculty conversations. One thread stood out. It detailed meetings between Aldrich and administrators before Elijah's assignment was ever submitted. They had known about his capabilities, had studied his prototypes. One line stood in bold. If he files, we lose leverage. We need to act before he does. The proof was damning. They hadn't just doubted him. They had planned for his erasure. Elijah's legal team added the documents to their counterclaim. They filed for damages. Public sympathy swelled. A coalition of civil rights attorneys offered support. Energy experts signed petitions, stating the invention's independence. The pressure mounted. Still, Elijah refused to gloat. He returned to his workbench. Because the mission hadn't changed. It was never about winning a war with Harvard. It was about building a future no court could unwrite. And yet, just as things seemed to stabilize, another document arrived, this one not from Harvard. It was from the U.S. Patent Office. An objection had been filed against his patent. The source? A shell company based in Delaware. And beneath that shell, a familiar connection. Harvard wasn't just suing. They were trying to rewrite history from the inside out. Then Harvard sued him, claiming they owned the original idea. The summons came on a Wednesday morning, sealed in an envelope, stamped with institutional indifference. Elijah had seen his name in headlines, academic papers, even protests, but never like this. Harvard University v. Elijah Carr. It felt surreal, like fiction scripted to make irony bleed. The very institution that had once tried to fail him, now claimed he had succeeded too well, and worse, that his success didn't belong to him. The lawsuit accused Elijah of violating Harvard's intellectual property policy, alleging that his decentralized energy model had been developed using university-owned resources, facilities, and academic programming. In their filing, Harvard painted a narrative of partnership, as though Elijah's innovation had been nurtured inside their walls rather than smothered. They mentioned the assignment Aldrich had crafted. They mentioned the classroom. They referenced the lab space Elijah once used for after-hours soldering, the same one he was nearly barred from. To Elijah, it wasn't just legal maneuvering. It was institutional gaslighting. They had denied his patent, questioned his genius, placed his work under suspicion, and now that it had become valuable, they wanted the credit wrapped in a lawsuit, dressed as fairness. But Elijah didn't panic. He gathered everything: receipts, emails, diagrams, time-stamped drafts. He compiled purchase records, showing every component bought with his own money. He included the hardware list he scavenged from surplus auctions. In one particularly painful piece of evidence, he attached a food stamp ledger from a month where he'd skipped meals to buy thermal paste and wires. It was humiliating on the surface, but it told a deeper truth. This invention wasn't funded by Harvard. It was funded by hunger, by silence, by a boy who refused to stop building even when the world refused to believe in him. His legal team responded swiftly. They filed a motion to dismiss, citing lack of ownership, lack of support, and the university's own internal contradictions. And they attached the leaked emails, proof that Harvard had sought to contain him, not cultivate him. The contradiction was loud. In one world, he was called a fraud. In the other, he was being claimed like a trophy. The lawsuit became national news within hours. Talk shows dissected the hypocrisy. Legal analysts debated whether Harvard's claim would hold in court. Social media reignited. Old clips from Elijah's interviews resurfaced. Protesters returned to the gates of the university. Their chants sharper now. You can't sue what you tried to erase. Every major newspaper covered the case. Some headlines carried quiet respect. Others bordered on sensationalism. But none could deny the undercurrent pulsing beneath it all. America had a problem recognizing black genius, until it wanted to own it. Elijah returned to Carr Systems and kept working. His team stayed close, shielding him from reporters, the chaos, the legal noise. But every time he sat at his workstation, soldering pieces, or reviewing code, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the court pressing on his shoulders. It wasn't just about him anymore. If he lost, it would send a message to every inventor who came after him, that even your pain could be patented by someone else. But then the twist came. Aldrich filed his own lawsuit. Separate from Harvard's, he claimed defamation, emotional distress, professional sabotage. His filing stated that Elijah's accusations, combined with the leaked recordings and public protests, had irreparably damaged his reputation and career prospects. The man who once tried to fail Elijah was now portraying himself as the victim of a witch hunt. He cited social media backlash, claimed his words were taken out of context, even argued that his classroom management style had been misunderstood through a lens of racial hypersensitivity. It was the final insult. The professor who dismissed Elijah, mocked diversity, and orchestrated academic sabotage now stood in court documents as someone allegedly injured by exposure. His lawsuit complicated everything. The two cases became legally entangled, threatening to stall Elijah's patent defense. His invention, his life's work, now sat in legal limbo, tied up in claims of misconduct and ownership that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with power. The media lost its mind. News anchors fumbled to remain neutral. Editorials exploded with outrage. Civil rights attorneys began lining up behind Elijah's legal team, filing amicus briefs, and calling the countersuit a dangerous precedent in weaponized institutional racism. They weren't just fighting for Elijah anymore. They were fighting for every black student who had been dismissed, diminished, and then retroactively claimed. But behind the public storm, Elijah's world grew quieter. He stopped giving interviews, stopped checking headlines. He poured his energy into the lab, not as a distraction, but as defense. Each new breakthrough became his proof. Each energy model that lit up an underserved block became a rebuttal louder than any legal filing. His invention kept growing. His systems kept running. Even in the shadow of lawsuits, his light refused to dim. Still, the emotional toll crept in. Some nights he stayed in the lab past sunrise, not because he needed to work, but because he feared stopping. Stillness felt like surrender. His team noticed the change, the deepening shadows under his eyes, the rare moments where he'd pause mid-sentence, lost in a thought that carried more weight than he could speak aloud. They rallied around him, not with speeches or sympathy, but with action. They organized internal review sessions, built new code variations, strengthened security, created public archives of every document tied to the invention. Carr Systems turned itself into a fortress, not just of innovation, but of proof. Every corner, every keystroke became a message. This is ours. He earned it. You can't take it. The court date neared. Legal scholars predicted a long battle. The dual suits, Harvard's ownership claim, and Aldrich's countersuit, risked delaying Elijah's ability to license or expand his technology. Investors grew cautious. Partners paused. The invention sat on the edge of global implementation, but the legal fog choked its reach. It was everything they'd wanted. If they couldn't destroy it, they'd delay it. If they couldn't claim it, they'd contain it. But Elijah had one last strategy. He reached out to someone quietly. Devon. Not for money, not for media, for leverage. Together, they prepared a final countermeasure. Because if Harvard and Aldrich wanted a fight, Elijah would give them one. But not in court. He would fight them with exposure. Then Aldrich countersued, and the case threatened to bury Elijah's invention in legal limbo. When the defamation lawsuit failed to silence Elijah in court, Aldrich took his campaign to the court of public opinion. It began with a quiet op-ed published in a mid-level academic journal. It framed itself as a reflection on pedagogical tensions in a polarized era, but it didn't take long to recognize who it was about. The article described a student with a chip on his shoulder, someone who resisted authority and struggled with collaboration. No names were used, but the subtext was sharp, and the timing made it impossible to miss. The piece was picked up by a few conservative education blogs. Then it spread wider. By the weekend, Aldrich's name reappeared, not in court filings but in headlines. He gave interviews to networks eager for counter-narratives. With a calm, calculated demeanor, he described Elijah as brilliant, yes, but troubled. He cited behavioral concerns. Claimed Elijah was often combative in class. He mentioned unnamed incidents from Elijah's high school years, subtly implying a pattern. One outlet referred to Elijah as a formerly troubled teen turned inventor, shrinking his achievement into a recovery arc rather than what it truly was, a rebellion against erasure. Aldrich didn't need to prove anything. He just needed to plant enough doubt. And it worked at first. Online, old whispers returned. Trolls resurfaced. Comment sections darkened. Some reposted blurry photos from Elijah's early school records. Out-of-context quotes from disciplinary write-ups. Most were trivial. Tardiness. Skipping study hall. A confrontation with a teacher over being falsely accused of cheating. But in the hands of Aldrich's allies, these moments became fuel. A former professor from another department claimed Elijah had once raised his voice during office hours. Another suggested he struggled with humility. Overnight, Elijah was forced to defend his existence instead of his invention. News panels debated whether his attitude clouded his brilliance. Words like difficult, entitled, and defensive surfaced, terms historically weaponized against black men who dared to question authority. The media turned the conversation from "did Harvard steal his idea?" to "was he too disruptive to begin with?" The strategy was familiar. When they couldn't disprove your work, they discredited your character. Elijah watched it unfold, like a slow-motion repeat of everything he had survived. But this time he wasn't alone. Devon responded within hours of the first smear piece. He published a detailed thread, point by point, debunking Aldrich's claims. He released screenshots of course evaluations, praising Elijah's collaboration. Former students chimed in, sharing their own stories of Aldrich's biases. One posted an email where Aldrich had downgraded a paper because it felt too activist in tone. Then came the scientists. Black engineers who had risen through academia despite similar sabotage shared their stories in solidarity. They described the invisible rules, the careful code switching, the penalties for speaking up. One former Ivy League professor publicly wrote, "They'll make you earn your place twice and still call it luck." Another added, "They fear black brilliance because it doesn't ask for permission." Elijah's name surged again, but now through testimonies of resistance. A documentary crew picked up the thread. They began following Elijah's case from the inside, filming late-night work sessions at Carr Systems, capturing court hearings, interviewing former professors, classmates, and mentors. The footage showed a young man weathering a storm with more grace than most systems deserved. Cameras caught him wiring solar grids in Detroit, teaching teens how to build battery banks, rewriting algorithms between legal briefings. The documentary reframed him not as a martyr but as a builder under siege. The public responded. Petitions surged. Harvard students flooded administrative inboxes with demands to drop the lawsuit. STEM programs invited Elijah to speak. School districts asked for free licensing of his energy model. Tech podcasts ran episodes dissecting how character assassination had become the final stage of institutional resistance. But the media machine Aldrich had stirred wouldn't stop easily. He gave one more interview. It aired live, on a national morning show. Calm tone, controlled smile. He said he never wanted this to become racial, but suggested some students interpret guidance as obstruction. He didn't name Elijah. He didn't need to. He leaned forward, looked into the camera and said, "There are patterns in behavior that often explain outcomes. Not everything is about discrimination." It was a masterclass in weaponized civility. But just when the media tide seemed poised to turn again, something unexpected happened. A link surfaced on Reddit. Anonymous. No tags. No caption. Just a URL titled, Aldridge Office Mic. At first, no one paid attention. But within the hour it spread like wildfire. It was a recording, and it shattered everything. Then a secret recording from Aldridge's own office was leaked, and it shattered everything. The recording opened with static just enough to make listeners lean in, but when the voice became clear, it sliced through every conversation, denial and defense Harvard had tried to maintain. Aldridge, unfiltered, unaware, unforgiven. His voice was unmistakable, cold, calculated, confident, not the measured tone he used on camera. This was the voice of someone speaking privately, someone who didn't believe anyone was listening, or anyone would dare expose him, if they were. "We can't let this boy be the face of innovation." The sentence hit the internet like a dropped match in dry brush. It was clipped from a longer conversation, allegedly recorded months before Elijah's invention was submitted, captured during an internal faculty discussion that had somehow been saved and leaked. The voice went on, "He's too loud, too independent. He doesn't play the game. If we let someone like that define the future of tech, the whole system unravels." Then laughter. Then another voice, unidentified, muttering, "Besides, no one will believe he built that alone." The leak was anonymous. The timing, devastating. Within hours, the clip flooded social media. Journalists verified the audio's authenticity with forensic labs. Voice matching software confirmed it was Aldridge. No room for denials, no buffer for interpretation. His words were played on repeat, on news broadcasts, in protest chants, across Twitter threads and TikTok stitches. Every major outlet led with it. CNN called it the smoking gun. The New York Times used one word for the headline: exposed. Harvard's administration went silent for 40. Then, late on a Friday evening, long after the news cycle had spun itself raw, they released a short two-sentence statement. "We are terminating Professor Stephen Aldridge's employment, effective immediately. We are deeply disturbed by the content of the recently surfaced audio and are initiating a full investigation into past faculty conduct." It wasn't justice. It wasn't an apology. But it was proof. The lawsuits crumbled within days. Harvard's legal team withdrew the claim against Elijah without ceremony. No apology. No restitution. Just a terse withdrawal, buried in court filings. Aldridge's defamation suit vanished with it, dismissed with prejudice. The intellectual property challenge was dropped. The patent belonged to Elijah again. Unquestioned, unchallenged, unshared. Outside the courthouse, cameras swarmed. But Elijah didn't give a victory speech. He stepped into the sunlight with the same quiet resolve he had carried into the darkest chapters. His lawyer read a short statement. Elijah just stood, his hands tucked in his coat pockets, his eyes fixed on the horizon, vindicated, but not triumphant, because while the war had ended, the damage couldn't be undone. He returned to Carr Systems and walked through the doors to a standing ovation. His team cheered. Some wept. Others simply nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. It wasn't just his name that had been cleared. It was the truth they had all carried. The belief that systems had tried to fracture. The lab threw a small party that night. Nothing loud. No just laughter, music, and the release of breath none of them had realized they'd been holding for so long. Elijah didn't say much. He thanked them, sat near the windows, watched the city lights flicker in the distance, each one powered by grids not yet smart enough to carry the future. He knew the real work was still ahead. But that night, for the first time in months, he slept. And then came the twist. It happened 2 weeks later, just after the last headlines faded. An older man appeared at the Carr Systems reception desk, wearing a janitor's uniform and holding a worn envelope in his hand. His face was tired but kind, the type of expression carved by years of watching things others never noticed. He asked for Elijah by name. When Elijah came out, the man introduced himself quietly. He'd worked maintenance at Harvard for nearly 30 years, never involved in politics, never called out racism, though he saw it daily. But after the news broke, after the tape leaked, and the truth became undeniable, he remembered something buried under years of silence and dust. A blueprint room, off limits, forgotten. It had once belonged to the engineering department, locked during renovations nearly a decade ago. He'd cleaned it a few times, noticed stacks of boxes filled with student prototypes, lab notebooks, early concepts. Most were unmarked. Some had names scribbled faintly on fading paper. What stood out to him, even then, was how many of those names were black. He thought about it often. He'd even asked once quietly, what would happen to those projects? Abandoned, they told him. Expired work. But he remembered them. The ambition in those sketches. The precision. The promise. And when he saw Elijah's name on the news, he recognized it. Because one of those boxes had carried it years before the lawsuit. Years before the patent. The name was spelled slightly different. E. Carr. Scrawled on a binder beneath layers of dust. That's when he realized this wasn't new. Harvard hadn't just tried to erase Elijah. They'd been erasing black minds for decades. He handed Elijah the envelope. Inside were scanned photos, notes, names, project summaries, concepts that had never seen daylight. Students who had disappeared from the system without headlines or lawsuits or protests. Ideas lost, not because they lacked potential, but because they lacked protection. Elijah stared at the documents in silence. He didn't know these names. But he knew these stories. He saw inventions built from struggle, shaped by neighborhoods like his, focused on survival, accessibility, equity, and he saw the same pattern repeated. Promising work quietly shelved. No faculty sponsors, no funding, no follow-up, buried brilliance. It wasn't just about him anymore. It never had been. Harvard hadn't failed once. It had been failing systematically, silently for years. But when a former janitor showed him old lab blueprints, Elijah realized this wasn't just about him. Harvard had buried dozens of black minds. The blueprint scans weren't enough. Elijah needed to see them himself. With the former janitor's help and a reluctant nod from Harvard's risk-averse legal team, desperate to avoid further exposure, he was granted access to the building's forgotten sublevel. The corridor was narrow and unlit, paved with cold tile worn down by decades of silence. Pipes clanged softly above, and each echo felt like it came from the past itself. The janitor led him to a rusted door marked Archival Room D. No security keypad, just a tarnished key, and years of institutional neglect. Inside, the room was suffocating in dust and silence. Stacks of cardboard boxes lined metal racks like coffins. Some labels had faded beyond legibility. Others bore names typed by student assistants long gone. A few bore only years. 2004, 1998, 1986. There were no signs of sorting, no catalog system, just a cold graveyard of promise, sealed in paper and plastic. Elijah stood frozen. These weren't abandoned assignments. They were abandoned futures. He reached for the first box within arm's reach. It was heavier than expected, stuffed with binders, wires, notepads. The name was unfamiliar, Terrence Milton. The folder inside read, Rural Microgrid, Distribution, Using Repurposed Vehicle Batteries. His heart tightened. The design was crude, but brilliant. Ahead of its time, a prototype that could have powered low-income neighborhoods off junkyard waste. The notes were detailed. The math checked out. But scrawled across the evaluation page in red ink was one word, infeasible.
Elijah opened another.
And another. And another. Each told the same story. Names he didn't know. Black names. Latina names. A few had immigrant surnames. All tied to projects that mirrored his own. Early attempts at energy decentralization, educational tech, medical aids built from recycled hardware. Some were handwritten on loose paper, others came with hand-soldered boards, fractured now from time. Each had been evaluated, dismissed and filed into institutional memory with no intention of resurrection. He wept quietly, not out of sadness alone, but out of recognition. Each circuit board, each scribbled diagram, felt like a mirror from a timeline where he hadn't survived the system, where he too had been boxed up, stored in darkness, forgotten. His tears smudged the corners of brittle graph paper. This wasn't a personal victory anymore. This was a cemetery, a mass burial of brilliance. He didn't speak much on the drive home. His team noticed his silence but gave him space. For 2 days, he barely left his office, sorting the scans, digitizing the work, cross-referencing names. He pulled student records. Some were expelled. Others dropped out. A few had died. and not a single one had received public credit for their work. It wasn't enough to remember them. They had to be revived. He built a digital repository. No splashy name, just a clean interface. A tab for each innovator. High-res scans of their work. Side-by-side breakdowns of the systems they built. Technical analysis. Biographical notes. In places where he could find the creators' families, he reached out, quietly, respectfully, to confirm permission, to let them know that their child, their sibling, their cousin had once built something the world should have seen. And when the site went live, it exploded. The internet erupted. Within 24 hours, Harvard's Hidden Files was trending on Twitter. Journalists combed through the archive, stunned by what they found. Commentators called it a digital museum of sabotage. Tech influencers reviewed the designs and validated their potential. One engineer remarked, "This blueprint right here, it's exactly what we're piloting now in 2025. Someone sketched this in." Reddit forums broke down the patents that could have been. TikTok creators made tribute videos. Professors at other schools launched their own internal reviews, fearful of what similar archives might lurk on their campuses. But the loudest response didn't come from the media. It came from the public. Young black students messaged Elijah directly, their words raw with recognition. They'd believed they were the first to dream these things. Now they saw themselves as part of a legacy, not of failure but of delayed brilliance. Parents wrote that their children, once unsure of their future in STEM, now spoke with purpose. Teachers requested permission to integrate the archive into their curriculum. And slowly, a new narrative formed. These weren't forgotten students. They were pioneers denied oxygen. Elijah's inbox overflowed. Offers came in. Invitations, museum exhibits, even TED Talks. He declined most of them. He wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in restoration. Each profile in the archive carried more than a name. It carried a mission: to finish what had been started, to credit what had been erased, to treat brilliance like a seed that could still bloom decades later. He organized partnerships with universities that wanted to reevaluate past expulsions. He began awarding posthumous honorary degrees. He launched fellowships in the names of each buried genius. Care Systems wasn't just an innovation lab anymore. It was a resurrection lab. They took the best of each project and prototyped them anew, using modern tools, updated code, today's materials, but never changing the core, never modifying the vision.
Every time something worked, every time they brought one of those blueprints to life, the team rang a small bell mounted above the whiteboard.
They called it the Bell of Restoration. Within months, several of the resurrected projects were being tested in low-income communities. One helped regulate water filtration in neglected housing complexes. Another introduced an adaptive learning tool in charter schools that couldn't afford iPads, and all of it, every breakthrough, traced back to a design once hidden in the dark. But Elijah wasn't done. Not even close. Because resurrection wasn't enough. These minds deserved more than tribute. They deserved lineage, legacy, infrastructure. Elijah launched a new mission, not to invent, but to restore. Elijah's lab had grown beyond its original walls. What had once been a workshop pulsing with hidden innovation, transformed into a place where centuries-old injustices could finally be made visible. The glass facade of Carr Systems became a mirror for the unacknowledged minds it housed. Black students came from all over, underfunded districts, forgotten suburbs, first-generation engineers. They didn't just tour the facility, they unpacked their own dreams inside it. Within those workstations, they saw what they could build. More importantly, they saw what they could become. They saw that the system didn't define them. They defined the system. Inside the main hall, past rows of desks and soldering stations, stood a corridor lined with illuminated plaques, each bearing the name of a student whose work was once buried. The corridor glowed softly in the late afternoon light. Elijah built scholarships under each forgotten name: the Terrence Milton Fund, the LaToya Ramirez Fellowship, the Marcus G. Thompson Innovation Prize. These weren't tokens. They were promises, affirmations that brilliance did not expire because the world ignored it. When the first scholarship recipient stepped into the lab, the hall erupted in applause. Cameras flashed, but Elijah watched quietly, feeling only something deeper than pride: a welcome home. Meanwhile, the system shifted. Word of Elijah's lab spread. Media described Carr Systems as lab, museum, incubator. 3 words rarely applied at once. High school tours filled the schedule. Conferences were held in the facility rather than corporate towers. Investors still knocked, But so did educators, activists, and politicians. The narrative had changed. This was not about one man, but about an ecosystem. And Elijah took his story to Washington. He stood before a congressional hearing on STEM equity. He testified not about his patent, but about the names in his archive and the futures they lost. He demanded reform, funding for students from marginalized backgrounds, audits of university lab practices, transparency in academic innovation. His voice echoed past the microphones, calm, factual, yet resonant with the weight of what he'd lived. Harvard tried to re-enter the story. They offered him an honorary award, an attempt at reconciliation wrapped in optics. The envelope arrived on Carr Systems' secretary's desk late one afternoon. The offer read, "We wish to recognize your contributions to innovation and invite you to accept Harvard's Distinguished Alumni Award." Elijah declined, not out of spite, but because accepting would mean accepting their framing of him. He had not waited for their permission to succeed. He had earned his path. Saying yes would have been rewriting his narrative to fit their terms. A twist emerged. One of his scholarship recipients, a quiet young woman named Naomi Daniels, from a rural town in Georgia, developed a portable energy sensor using one of the archived blueprints. Her prototype caught attention for the first time, not as restoration, but as original creation. She presented it at a national competition. The irony was sharp. The world called her the heir to Carr Systems. But Elijah insisted otherwise. He told the audience, "She isn't my heir. She's my peer." The system never gave her a seat at the table, so we built a new table. The moment became viral. In a single evening, Naomi turned headlines away from Harvard's scandals to the new frontier forged by Carr Systems. The change spread beyond labs and scholarships. School curricula, in several states, began referencing Elijah's archive. Middle school science classes taught students about rediscovered innovations alongside the history of civil rights. Panels at educational conferences featured Carr Systems engineers as keynote speakers, often juxtaposed with university deans who once declined them. Newspapers ran editorials titled, "Why the Future Must Include Those Who Were Once Ignored." Still, Elijah's hands stayed on the blueprint. He never abandoned the build, because he knew the core truth. Policy could change systems, but invention changed lives. His team deployed microgrid systems in Detroit's East Side and in a Navajo reservation community. Each installation wasn't just technology, it was a recalibration of priority. When a light went on in a formerly dark apartment, the quiet hum reminded him. They weren't just recipients, they were authors of their own power. The protests outside Harvard became more than symbols. Students held open-air lectures on campus about institutional racism and innovation. Alumni filed legal petitions. Donors withdrew gifts. Harvard responded with more statements, more internal reviews, but the momentum had shifted. The system's narrative no longer centered on them. Carr Systems and its underground archive had moved first. One late night, Elijah sat at his workstation. The lab was empty, the lights dimmed. He looked across the main hall at the corridor of plaques. Each illuminated name was a silent testament to what had been suppressed and what now surged. He felt fatigue, yes, but also something he hadn't felt in years: release. Then a soft buzz. A message appeared on his screen. Mississippi teacher needs meeting. 5th grader. Broken invention. Dream. Elijah paused. He knew what came next. Because the mission had never been to fix one invention. It was to ignite many. Until a public school teacher from Mississippi brought him a 5th grader, with a broken invention, and a dream. Elijah hadn't planned to take any more meetings that week. The lawsuits were behind him. The interviews had quieted, and the lab had finally settled into its rhythm. But something about the message caught his attention. It was brief, sincere, hand-typed. A public school teacher from Mississippi who had driven nearly 10 hours north with one of her 5th graders. No media, no grants, just a car, a bag of tools, and a request. He built something. It doesn't work, but he wants to show you. Elijah agreed. When they arrived, the teacher looked exhausted, but hopeful. She didn't speak much, just introduced herself as Mrs. Gwen Hatcher, and placed a small cardboard box on the Carr Systems reception desk. Beside it stood a boy no older than 10. Shy, slight. His hands fidgeted at his sides, eyes scanning the lab in awe. Elijah noticed the nervous way the boy kept glancing at his shoes, like he didn't believe he belonged in a place with glass walls and glowing plaques. Elijah crouched down and smiled. "What'd you bring me?" The boy opened the box. Inside, surrounded by foam and paper towels, was a small wooden board with nails, wires, a bulb, and a crumpled battery housing. It looked like a science fair project, mid-meltdown, but Elijah's eyes caught something deeper. The symmetry of the connections, the way the wires wrapped tightly around each screw, the labeling. This wasn't random. This was hunger for knowledge. Clumsy, sure, but honest. The boy spoke for the first time. It's supposed to light up when you step on it. A pressure-based light switch. Elijah reached out gently. Can I try? The boy nodded. Elijah poked the wires, checked the connections, and then he saw it. One loose loop, almost imperceptible, shaking slightly under the weight of the board. One twist, Elijah whispered. He tightened the wire, flattened the housing, and stepped back. Try again. The boy hesitated, stepped on the plate. The bulb blinked once, then glowed. Bright. The boy gasped. His hands shot to his face, as if trying to hide the impossible. His teacher covered her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes. In the silence, only the hum of the lab machines and the soft glow of that single bulb filled the space. And Elijah. He smiled. Not because it worked, but because of why it worked. In that moment, he wasn't the founder of Carr Systems. He wasn't the man who beat Harvard. He wasn't the inventor who filed the patent heard around the world. He was the boy he used to be. The one wiring scrap metal in his mother's apartment. The one rejected from camps. The one who rebuilt fans not for credit, but because the world wouldn't cool itself. And now he stood on the other side of that storm, watching someone else spark. Not despite the system, but beyond it. He turned to Mrs. Hatcher. Where did he get the idea? She smiled, finally exhaling. Saw your video. The one where you lit up the alley in Detroit, he said. Why don't we have that here? Then he started sketching. Elijah's throat tightened. The boy had never met him, but he had already started building. That's when Elijah knew. His greatest invention wasn't the patent. It wasn't the energy grid or the AI optimization, or even the archive. His greatest invention was possibility. The space he had carved in a world designed to keep him out. The ripple effect of refusing to be erased. A future where black brilliance wasn't filtered through racism. Where genius wasn't conditional. Where no one had to build in the dark. He stood up, placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, and asked, What's your name? Josiah. Elijah nodded. You ever want to work here one day? Josiah's eyes widened. I don't know. You should, Elijah said, because this lab, it was built for you. The teacher stifled a sob. Elijah brought Josiah through the corridor of plaques, showed him the workshop, let him sit at one of the main stations. The boy touched the tools like they were sacred. He didn't ask for help. He didn't need validation. He just belonged. And that was the point. Later that day, as they prepared to leave, Josiah turned quietly to Elijah. His voice was barely louder than a whisper. I want to be like you. Elijah didn't answer right away, because once, that sentence would have shattered him. It would have reminded him of the weight, the burden, the isolation that came with being the first, the only, the one who made it. But not anymore. Not in this place. Not in this time. Now he wasn't the exception. He was the start. And as the boy whispered, I want to be like you, Elijah smiled, because now he wasn't the exception. He was the start. If you've ever been overlooked, unheard, or told you didn't belong, this story was yours too. For every black mind, buried before it had the chance to shine, it's time to dig up the truth and light the way forward. Type yes if you believe brilliance should never be silenced. Subscribe if this broke your heart and lit a fire.